Right now, somewhere along China's eastern coastline, a warship is being lowered into the water, not a patrol boat, not a corvette, a full-scale, combat-ready naval vessel, a destroyer, a frigate, maybe a landing ship the size of a city block. And by the time this month ends, 2 more will follow it. That is not an exaggeration. That is the current production rate of the People's Liberation Army Navy. 3 warships per month on average across multiple shipyards, running simultaneously around the clock. Now go to the other side of the Pacific. The United States, the country that builds the most technologically advanced warships on Earth, is struggling to deliver a single destroyer on schedule. Ships that were supposed to be commissioned years ago are still sitting in dry dock. Repair backlogs at U.S. naval yards have grown so severe that some vessels wait 18 months just to get basic maintenance. The USS Boise, a submarine, sat out of service for years. So what do you think? Is this just a temporary slowdown or something much bigger? Let me know in the comments. Before it could even enter a shipyard. This is not a story about weapons technology. Both countries build capable warships. This is a story about something much older, much more consequential, and much harder to fix quickly. This is a story about industrial capacity, but here's where it gets interesting, because this isn't just about ships anymore, and how one nation quietly built the most powerful shipbuilding machine on Earth while the other was not paying attention. To understand why this gap matters so much, you have to go back to a basic truth about naval warfare and global power projection. Ships are not just weapons, they are the physical infrastructure of sea control. Every trade route, every security guarantee, every carrier strike group that the United States uses to signal resolve in the Pacific. All of it depends on the ability to build, repair, and sustain a fleet. And a fleet, like any industrial system, is only as strong as the supply chain behind it. During World War II, the United States understood this with absolute clarity. At its peak, American industry was producing escort carriers in less than 3 weeks. Destroyers were rolling out of yards in under 6 months. The country had over 1,000 shipyards operating simultaneously, with millions of workers, round-the-clock shifts, and a government that treated industrial output as a direct measure of national survival. That ecosystem won the war. United States did not win primarily because its ships were technically superior. It won because it could absorb losses and replace them faster than any adversary could sink them. Industrial depth was the weapon. After the war, that industrial ecosystem was allowed to wind down. It made economic sense at the time. The Cold War was largely a land and air competition in Europe. The merchant shipping industry moved offshore. Shipbuilding, without government subsidies and strategic urgency, could not compete with cheaper labor markets in Asia. By the 1980s, the American commercial shipbuilding industry had collapsed to a fraction of its former scale. What remained was a narrow cluster of naval-only yards, protected by law, but no longer embedded in a broader industrial base. Today, the United States has approximately 20 major shipyards capable of building naval vessels. Most of them are operating at or near capacity already. Not because they are building a lot, but because what they are building takes so long and requires so many specialized inputs that the throughput has never recovered. Now look at what China built. Starting in the 1990s and accelerating sharply after 2010, China made a strategic decision that is now paying off in ways that defense planners in Washington are only beginning to fully absorb. It decided to dominate commercial shipbuilding globally, not as a business strategy, but as a security strategy. The logic was not complicated. A country that builds the most container ships, oil tankers, bulk carriers, and LNG vessels in the world develops something that cannot be purchased overnight: a deep industrial ecosystem. Shipyard infrastructure, massive dry docks, steel production tuned to marine-grade specifications, welding talent, precision machining, electrical systems integration, logistics coordination, all of it scaled up and refined through commercial volume. Then, when the time came to accelerate naval construction, that entire ecosystem was already in place. And this is where the story stops being about ships and starts being about something much bigger. The transition from commercial to military production is not seamless, but the underlying capacity, the workers, the steel, the dry docks, the supply chains is transferable. You are not building a naval shipbuilding industry from scratch. You are redirecting an already massive one. China now controls roughly 47% of global commercial shipbuilding output by tonnage. In some vessel categories, that share is even higher. Jiangnan Shipyard in Shanghai is one of the largest in the world. Hudong Zhangla produces both commercial LNG carriers and naval vessels on the same waterfront. The Dalian shipyard has launched aircraft carriers. The sheer physical scale is staggering. A single large Chinese dry dock can accommodate multiple destroyers simultaneously. The workforce is in the hundreds of thousands across the naval industrial complex. Delivery timelines that would take American yards years are being achieved in months. To understand what this looks like on a practical engineering level, consider what building a modern guided missile destroyer actually requires. The hull alone involves thousands of tons of marine-grade steel cut, shaped, welded, and assembled into modular sections. Each module, sometimes weighing hundreds of tons, is fabricated separately, then brought together in the dry dock through a process called block construction. China has mastered block construction at speed. The modules are precision fit, the cranes are large enough to handle the heaviest sections, and the scheduling is optimized so that there is no idle time between stages. Then come the systems: propulsion, combat management computers, radar arrays, weapons integration, communications. Each of these is its own engineering domain, sourced from its own supply chain. China has spent 2 decades systematically building domestic suppliers for every one of these categories. Where it once relied on foreign components, particularly in electronics and propulsion, it is now largely indigenized production. That reduces delays, reduces cost, and reduces the diplomatic vulnerability of depending on foreign-controlled supply chains. The United States, by contrast, has seen its naval supply chain fragment. Some critical components, specialized propeller castings, certain steel alloys, electronic components, have very few domestic suppliers. Sometimes only one. A production problem at a single sub-tier supplier can delay a warship by months. This is not a theoretical risk. It has happened repeatedly. Submarine deliveries have been delayed because of shortfalls in specific castings and specialized steel. Aircraft carrier construction overruns have been partly attributed to supply chain bottlenecks that the shipbuilding prime contractors cannot fully control. Beyond supply chains, there is the workforce question. Skilled shipbuilding requires trades that take years to develop. Welders certified for marine applications, structural fitters, pipe fitters, electricians capable of working inside the confined and complex spaces of a warship. These are not jobs you fill by posting a listing online. They require apprenticeship pipelines, vocational programs, sustained demand that makes the career path attractive. For decades, American shipbuilding demand was too low and too inconsistent to sustain robust training pipelines. The result is a workforce that is smaller than needed, older on average, and not being replaced at the rate retirements are happening. Here's where it gets complicated, because the United States has recognized this problem and is trying to respond. The question is whether the response can actually close the gap in any time frame that matters. The Pentagon has commissioned studies. Shipbuilding budgets have increased. There are calls for public-private partnerships, workforce development programs, and allied cooperation. Japan and South Korea, countries with world-class commercial shipyards, have been quietly discussed as potential partners for U.S. naval maintenance and even some construction. On paper, this looks like the beginning of a solution. But geography and industrial economics are stubborn. Rebuilding a shipbuilding ecosystem is not like building a new factory for a single product. It is recreating an entire industrial food chain. You need the steel, you need the suppliers, you need the workforce, you need the shipyards themselves, which require enormous capital investment and years to construct, and you need sustained, predictable demand over long enough a period that private companies and individual workers believe the investment in capacity is worth making. That combination takes time measured in decades, not years. Analysis from the Congressional Budget Office and independent defense researchers has consistently found that even with significantly increased investment, closing the production rate gap with China within a 10 to 15-year window would require changes in regulatory environment, labor law, industrial policy, and procurement practice that are politically difficult and organizationally complex to execute simultaneously. There is also the cost dimension. American-built naval ships are among the most expensive in the world, not because American engineers are less capable, but because the cost structure of American shipbuilding reflects a narrow, specialized, low-volume industry, high overhead, expensive labor relative to output, and a procurement system that layers requirements and oversight in ways that add cost and time. China builds at a cost per ton that is a fraction of what American yards charge, partly because of scale, partly because of labor economics, and partly because of a government that prioritizes throughput over unit economics. The risk, then, did not disappear when the U.S. recognized the problem. The risk moved. It moved from the tactical level, individual ship quality, to the strategic level. What happens if there is a sustained conflict in the Pacific that requires replacing losses faster than a peacetime industrial base can produce replacements? This is the geopolitical dimension that makes the shipbuilding gap more than an industrial policy story. The United States Navy has operated under a model of dominance through quality. Fewer ships, but better ones. Advanced systems, superior training, integrated alliances. And in peacetime or low-intensity competition, that model has worked well. But naval strategy in a serious peer conflict is not just about who has the more capable ship. It is also about depth. Attrition, the ability to sustain pressure over months or years when vessels are being damaged, sunk, or worn out in operational tempo that peacetime maintenance schedules are not designed for. China's naval strategy appears to have internalized this lesson. A country that can build 3 warships per month in peacetime can potentially accelerate that further in crisis conditions, drawing on the same commercial infrastructure, the same workers, the same supply chains, scaled up under wartime priority. The United States, with its current industrial structure, cannot make that escalation in any rapid time frame. The yards are not there. The workers are not there. The supply chains are not deep enough. And here is the deeper truth that makes this entire situation worth understanding. The military balance between great powers has never been determined only by the weapon systems in existence at any given moment. It has been determined by the industrial capacity to sustain, replace, and expand those systems under the conditions of actual conflict. In 1942, the United States was already behind in warship numbers. Within 3 years, it had outproduced every other nation in history. That outcome was possible because decades of commercial and industrial development had created the underlying capacity to mobilize. China appears to have studied that lesson carefully. It has spent 30 years building an industrial base that is now functioning as a strategic asset, one that produces commercial value in peacetime and military capacity in crisis. The warships are not just warships. They are the visible output of a much deeper system. The next time you see a headline about a Chinese naval vessel being launched, the story is not really about that ship. It is about the dry dock behind it, the steel plant feeding it, the 10,000 workers trained to build it, and the 30 years of industrial policy that made all of that possible. And the question that defense planners, industrial strategists, and policymakers are now wrestling with is not how to build a better destroyer. It is how to rebuild from the ground up against the decades-long head start, the kind of industrial depth that makes military power sustainable over time. The risk did not disappear. It was never really about the ships. It was always about what you had behind them. If you want to understand how power really works behind the headlines, subscribe to Navy Reality. We break it down without the noise.